Chapter 24 of The House on the Downs by Gladys Edson Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Trap. The next day passed gloomily in preparation for Eve's funeral, which was to be held on the day following the conclusion of the public inquest set for Thursday. Fazenda Lee continued to improve under the care and guardianship of her two nurses. Relations between the various members of the household were strained. The atmosphere was one of suspicion and distrust, and Mark, for one, was impatient for the evening when Mercedes Quero proposed to lay a trap for the person she believed to be responsible for the outrages at the Grange. Almost any certainty was better than this suspense. Mark had won a few minutes' happiness by calling Irene Grayle on the telephone and arranging to meet her in Brighton when the sad affair of Eve's funeral should be over. Irene was a woman in 1,000. He had been a young ass not to recognize that fact years ago. Cynthia Melsom, whenever he encountered her in the halls, was discreet and non-communicative. She would give no further confidences. He must make what he could of what she had already told him. He laid the matter before Mercedes Quero, but she proved no less discreet than Cynthia and made few comments. Mark did, however, see her later in earnest consultation with the Scotland Yard man, Detective Inspector Burton, and he wondered uneasily what tragic disclosure the evening would bring forth. He could not get Cynthia's words out of his mind. Watch people's eyes. He was, however, unable to detect any signs of hidden insanity in the people at the Grange. He could read fear and mutual distrust in their eyes, but nothing more, and he felt that if this suspense were to continue many days longer, there was no telling what one might read in his eyes. Dr. Petherton, who had just come from Fazenta's sick room, dined at the Grange that night. To Mark's amazement, the physician announced his intention of allowing Mrs. Carswell to prepare some broth for his patient, as Fazenta had asked for it and did not seem to relish what the nurses prepared. Mark could imagine the little housekeeper's tremulous delight at the doctor's permission to do some service for Fazenta, but at the same time he was troubled about it. Was there an underlying motive in the physician's sudden lessening of the precautions with which he had surrounded his patient? Could he have done so at the instigation of Mercedes Quero for some definite purpose of her own? Mark could read little in the countenances of those at the table, except that Sir Quentin seemed considerably agitated. After dinner, Mercedes Quero made a rather singular request. She asked Dr. Petherton, Sir Quentin, Quenton Rotherdene, and Mark to go upstairs with her into the East Wing. Rodney Sherrod stared curiously at the detective. "Something wrong in the East Wing? I'd like to go up too, if you don't mind." "I am sorry," the detective refused, "but I want only those whom I have named." The Romany's dark face flushed. "In other words, I am under suspicion," his tone infinitely bitter. "Perhaps you are too ready to jump at conclusions," said Mercedes Quero quietly. "You were always too impetuous, Rodney," spoke up Mr. Elphick in his precise, disapproving way. "I suppose it is your gypsy blood." Rodney turned upon the little naturalist in a fury of uncontrolled rage. "By God, I'm not ashamed of my gypsy blood. I'd sooner own it to the milk and water that flows in a Gorgio's veins." "Easy, my boy, easy," admonished Sir Quentin, in the kindliest tone he had used to the Romany for many hours. Rodney shook back from his forehead his disordered black hair. "I wish to God, sir, you'd left me to grow up among the gypsies. What does a Romany want with Gorgio civilization? It only eats his heart out. I'm going back to my people as soon as ever I can. I'm done with the Gorgios and their ways." "Scandalous ingratitude!" gasped Mr. Elphick, as Rodney flung out of the room. Sir Quentin sighed. "Somehow I have failed in what I set out to do for the poor lad. Well, shall we go up to the East Wing now, Miss Quero? I'd be greatly obliged, Cousin Theophilus, if you would look over that pile of correspondence in my study. Some of the letters should be answered as soon as possible. I'll try to help out with them later." "I'm delighted to take charge of the letters, Quentin," beamed the little naturalist. "Don't you trouble about them at all. I'll get the imperative ones answered tonight." "That's good of you," said the baronet gratefully. "But don't sit up too late. Fazenta, poor girl, was planning to help." "Fazenta's assistance is not needed," observed Mr. Elphick a little stiffly. "I am glad to take entire charge of the letters." As the four men followed the detective into the upper story of the deserted wing, Mark found himself listening for the sound of furtive steps in the wall. He heard nothing, however, save their own footsteps. The woman detective led them into the large oak-paneled room at the end of the corridor where Eve, a few nights before, had been discovered lying in a swoon across the hearth. Mercedes Quero flashed the rays of her electric torch about the apartment, and the huge fireplace, with its ornately carved mantel, stood forth from the shadows. The dim shapes of the old furniture, trunks, and packing boxes that littered the bare floor showed but vaguely, and Quenton Rotherdene, stumbling over a low stool, recovered himself with a muttered oath. "Snap on that light, Miss Quero. The switch is just behind you." "I am afraid you will have to take your chances in semi-darkness, Mr. Rotherdene," she objected. "We are going to do without electricity for a while." The younger Rotherdene growled something about wasting time in damn theatrical nonsense, but Sir Quentin sat down resignedly on a chest of drawers, watching intently the detective's every movement. The first thing she did was to take a candle from her little handbag, light it, and stand it up in an ancient bronze vase on the mantel. The flickering light, accentuating the shadows, traced weird silhouettes of people and furniture upon the small area illumined by it. Dr. Petherton was distinctly nervous and ill at ease. "Why not come to the point of this, Miss Quero? What are we waiting for?" "We are waiting," the detective answered in a matter-of-fact tone, "for Cynthia Melsom. She should be here in a few minutes now." Quenton Rotherdene emitted a short, hard laugh. "Cynthia Melsom, eh? You don't really expect her to come, do you?" "She knows if she doesn't come, Mr. Rotherdene, she will be arrested on rather serious charges." There was a sound from the next room, as of a chair being moved. The doctor started up from the trunk he was sitting on. "Evidently we are not alone in this wing, Miss Quero." "No," she said composedly. "Inspector Burton and another detective are in the next room, also waiting." The doctor cleared his throat. "Well, I trust we shall not have to wait much longer. I have some other calls to make this evening." "You will have to see this out, Dr. Petherton, no matter how long it may be," Mercedes Quero replied. "Under no circumstances is anyone to leave this room until after Cynthia Melsom comes. If anyone attempts to do so, Inspector Burton and his assistant will take measures to prevent." The physician sank back on the trunk with a gasp. "A very high-handed proceeding," he spluttered. "May as well submit gracefully, Petherton," remarked Quenton Rotherdene. "We all of us seem to be in for a bad quarter of an hour, thanks to Miss Quero's stage management." The wavering candlelight playing over the younger Rotherdene's features lent them a satyr-like expression. A strained silence reigned in the shadow-engulfed room. Mercedes Quero sat on a packing box facing the hall in an attitude of anticipation, and the minutes slowly dragged by. Every slightest creak that old wood gives forth at night sounded abnormally loud, and Mark's imagination was so keen as to make him fancy that he heard a vague, faint stirring in the wall behind the oaken wainscoting. Both Sir Quentin and Dr. Petherton plainly chafed under the tension of inaction, but Quenton Rotherdene sat motionless, his brooding eyes never leaving the detective's countenance. A wind was rising, rattling the ancient shutters, and moaning through the cracks. The ordeal of waiting for they knew not what was becoming intolerable when they heard steps and the click of a woman's heels coming along the uncarpeted hall. Cynthia Melsom crossed the threshold and came into the circle of candle-glow. Behind her in the doorway bulked the figures of two men, Detective Inspector Burton and his assistant. The lady's maid looked uncommonly pale in the dim light, a bit defiant but weary, and her eyes had lost their usual brilliance. She was carrying a steaming cup from which arose the aroma of broth. Mercedes Quero stepped forward, took the cup from her hands, and whispered something which was inaudible to the others. Cynthia nodded significantly and drew back among the dark shapes of the furniture. Quenton Rotherdene got up and, crossing to the fireplace, lost himself in the shadows there. Mercedes Quero, carrying the cup which Cynthia had brought, advanced to Sir Quentin. In the breathless silence of the room, Mark again fancied he could detect an indistinct stir behind the wainscoting. Or was it simply the moan of the wind? "Sir Quentin," the woman detective said in a clear, distinct voice that carried through the room, "I want you to drink this broth, every drop of it." The candlelight marked deep riven lines in the baronet's face, curiously gray-hued. Mechanically he stretched forth his hand toward the cup. There was a frantic stir and clicking noise from the gulf of darkness by the fireplace, where Quenton Rotherdene had gone. Detective Inspector Burton advanced a step nearer. "Drink that broth to the last drop, Sir Quentin," Mercedes Quero commanded again. "No, don't drink it! For God's sake, don't!" The cry came in a frenzied, muffled voice. A sharper click sounded now by the fireplace, and the whole ornate mantel violently swung loose from the wall almost a foot. From the black, cavernous space beyond, a wild, puck-like figure sprang out and leaped for Mercedes Quero's throat. As the cup of broth was dashed to the floor, Detective Inspector Burton and his assistant hurled themselves upon the mad creature and dragged it back. The candlelight flickered on the plump, elderly figure of Theophilus Elphick, but the face was that of a fiend, and the animal-like cries and hideous bursts of laughter that echoed through the room betrayed the maniac brain, unchained at last. End of chapter 24.